The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Peterson's front porch as he slowly rocked in his favorite wooden chair, his weathered hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. At 93 years old, his daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise itself. Every morning, he would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., just as he had done during his military service nearly 7 decades ago. Harold's small white house sat on the corner of Maple and Oak Street, where he had lived for the past 50 years. The property wasn't large, but it was immaculately maintained, especially the garden that wrapped around the house like a colorful ribbon. It was his pride and joy, filled with roses, tulips, and his late wife Martha's beloved dahlias. As he sipped his coffee, his blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, surveyed his neighborhood. The town of Millbrook hadn't changed much over the years, which was just how he liked it. The same old grocery store still stood across the street, though its parking lot had grown larger recently. The expansion had brought more traffic, but Harold hadn't minded too much until now. Inside his house, everything had its place. Photographs lined the walls, some in black and white, others in fading color, telling the story of a life well lived. There was his wedding photo with Martha, pictures of their children growing up, and several from his military service. The most prominent was a large framed photograph of Harold in his uniform, standing proud and tall beside his military motorcycle in 1945. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Harold would walk the 3 blocks to the local Veterans Memorial. His steps might have been slower now, supported by a wooden cane he had carved himself, but he never missed these visits. The other regulars at the memorial had grown used to seeing him there, sitting on the stone bench, sometimes talking with young visitors about the war, but more often sitting in respectful silence. Today was different, though. As Harold finished his morning coffee, the quiet was broken by the distant rumble of motorcycles. He checked his watch, 7:15 a.m. They were early today. The sound grew louder as a group of motorcycles turned into the grocery store parking lot across the street. Their chrome pipes gleamed in the morning sun as 5, then 10, then 15 bikes pulled in. Harold watched as the riders dismounted their machines. They were a rough-looking bunch, dressed in leather vests covered in patches and logos he didn't recognize. This was the third time this week they had gathered there, and each time their group seemed to grow larger. The noise didn't bother Harold as much as others might think. After all, he had spent years around military motorcycles during the war. What concerned him was the changing atmosphere of his peaceful neighborhood. Yesterday, he had noticed empty beer cans in his garden, presumably tossed there by some of the riders. As he stood up to go inside, his joints protesting the movement, Harold caught the eye of one of the bikers, a tall man with a thick beard and a leather vest that read Spike across the back. The man nudged his companion and pointed at Harold, both of them laughing about something he couldn't hear. Harold straightened his back, nodded politely as he had always done throughout his life, and made his way inside. On his hallway table sat the morning's mail, bills, advertisements, and a letter from his grandson stationed overseas. The letter would have to wait, though. It was time to tend to his garden. As he gathered his gardening tools, the rumble of motorcycles continued outside. Harold glanced at the old trunk in the corner of his garage, covered with years of dust. Under that tarp lay memories of his own days on 2 wheels, but he pushed that thought aside. Those days were long gone, or so he thought. Little did Harold know that his quiet life was about to change dramatically. The peaceful mornings on his porch would soon become the backdrop for an unexpected confrontation that would not only challenge him, but would also remind everyone in Millbrook that age was just a number, and respect was something earned, not demanded. As he stepped into his garden, clippers in hand, Harold hummed an old military march to himself, drowning out the growing noise from across the street. For now, he would focus on his flowers. Tomorrow would take care of itself, just as it always had. The peaceful mornings that Harold Peterson had enjoyed for decades began to slip away as spring turned to summer. The motorcycle club's presence grew more disruptive with each passing day. What had started as occasional gatherings in the grocery store parking lot had evolved into daily meetings that often lasted well into the evening. On this particular morning, Harold stood at his mailbox, his hand trembling slightly as he retrieved his letters. The rumble of motorcycles had become so loud that he could feel the vibrations in his chest. Across the street, nearly 30 bikes were parked in neat rows, their riders gathered in small groups, their laughter and loud conversations echoing across the street. Spike, the leader with the thick beard, was holding court near the grocery store's wall. Harold had learned his real name was Michael Stevens, though nobody seemed to use it. As Harold watched, Spike revved his motorcycle repeatedly, causing several other riders to cheer and follow suit. The noise was deafening. Taking a deep breath, Harold decided it was time to speak up. He had survived World War II. Surely, he could handle a conversation with these young men. Using his cane for support, he carefully crossed the street. Several riders noticed his approach, nudging each other and smirking. "Excuse me," Harold said, his voice firm despite his age. "I was wondering if we could talk about the noise level. You see, many of us in the neighborhood." "What's that, old-timer?" Spike called out, cupping his hand to his ear mockingly. "Can't hear you over all this freedom." He revved his engine again, causing more laughter from the group. Harold stood his ground, his military bearing evident in his straight posture. "I'm not asking you to leave," he explained patiently. "Just to show some consideration for the neighborhood. There are families with young children, and some of us." "Listen, Grandpa," Spike interrupted, stepping closer. "This is a public parking lot. We got every right to be here." His voice carried a hint of threat that made several of his companions shift uncomfortably. "I understand that," Harold replied calmly. "I rode motorcycles myself in the war." This statement was met with exaggerated laughter. "Oh, did you hear that, boys?" Spike called out. "Gramps here used to ride." "What was it, a steam-powered bicycle?" The group erupted in laughter again. Harold felt his cheeks flush, not from embarrassment but from a rising anger he hadn't felt in years. Before he could respond, one of the younger riders gummed his engine, the blast of noise drowning out any possibility of further conversation. As Harold turned to leave, he noticed something that made his heart sink. Several empty beer cans had been tossed into his garden again, and one of the bikes was parked partially on his lawn, crushing some of his flowers. The disrespect was becoming more deliberate. Over the next few days, the situation worsened. The bikers seemed to take special pleasure in revving their engines whenever they saw Harold in his garden or on his porch. Some would slow down as they passed his house, engines roaring unnecessarily. A few even started calling him Gramps or Old-Timer in mocking tones whenever they saw him. One evening, as Harold sat in his living room looking through an old photo album, he heard a particularly loud commotion outside. Looking through his window, he saw several of the riders doing wheelies in the parking lot, dangerously close to his property line. Their bikes left dark rubber marks on the asphalt, and their wild behavior was drawing concerned looks from passersby. Harold's neighbors had started avoiding the area altogether. Mrs. Thompson from next door had stopped walking her dog past the parking lot. The local children no longer played in their front yards during the afternoons. The peaceful neighborhood was changing, and not for the better. That night, as Harold lay in bed listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles, he thought about how different these riders were from the brotherhood of motorcyclists he had known in the service. There had been a code of honor then, a respect for both the machines and the people around them. As he drifted off to sleep, his mind wandered to his own motorcycle days, not knowing that tomorrow would bring a turning point that would shake everyone's assumptions about the quiet old veteran on the corner. The morning started like any other, with Harold rising early to tend to his beloved garden. The sun had barely risen, and the air was crisp with early autumn coolness. As he stepped outside with his watering can, he immediately noticed something was wrong. His heart sank at the sight before him. During the night, several motorcycles had been parked partially on his lawn, leaving deep tire marks in the soft soil. Empty beer bottles were scattered across his carefully maintained flower beds, and cigarette butts dotted the ground like ugly brown freckles. But what caught Harold's attention and made his aged hands tremble wasn't the general mess. It was the damaged rose bush in the corner of his garden. This wasn't just any rose bush. Martha, his late wife, had planted it on their 40th wedding anniversary, just 5 years before she passed away. The fragrant pink roses had bloomed faithfully every year since then, a living reminder of their love. Now, one of the bikes had backed over it, crushing several branches and destroying most of the blooms. Harold slowly lowered himself to his knees, ignoring the protest of his joints. With gentle fingers, he touched the broken stems. One surviving rose hung limply, its petals scattered on the ground beneath it. The sight brought tears to his eyes, not just of sadness, but of a deep, earning anger he hadn't felt since his war days. "Hey, look who's up early," a mocking voice called out. Harold didn't need to turn around to know it was Spike. The sound of heavy boots on pavement told him several bikers were approaching. "Doing some gardening, Gramps?" Another voice chimed in, followed by laughter. "Sorry about the mess. Boys got a little carried away last night." Harold remained silent, still kneeling by the damaged rose bush. His mind traveled back to the day Martha had planted it. She had worn her favorite blue dress, her silver hair shining in the sunlight as she carefully placed the young plant in the ground. "This will bloom for years to come," she had said, "just like our love." "What's the matter, old-timer? Cat got your tongue?" Spike's voice was closer now, dripping with false concern. "It's just a bunch of flowers. We'll even buy you new ones if you stop being such a pain about our meetings." Slowly, carefully, Harold stood up. His old bones creaked, but his back was straight as a rod. When he turned to face the bikers, something in his expression made them take a step back. The usual gentle look in his pale blue eyes had been replaced by something steely, a glimpse of the young soldier he had once been. "This rose bush," Harold said, his voice quiet but firm, "was planted by my wife, Martha. She passed away 5 years ago." He paused, letting the words sink in. Even Spike had the decency to look uncomfortable. She was the kind of person who would give anyone the benefit of the doubt. She believed in the goodness of people, even when they didn't deserve it. A heavy silence fell over the group. A few of the younger riders shuffled their feet, looking anywhere but at Harold or the damaged roses. "I've been patient," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger. "I tried to be understanding. I remember what it's like to be young and feel invincible. But this," he gestured to the destroyed garden, "this shows neither strength nor courage. This shows nothing but cowardice." The word cowardice hung in the air like a thundercloud. Spike's face reddened, and he took a step forward. One of his older companions put a hand on his shoulder, holding him back. Harold turned away from them and bent down to pick up one of the fallen roses. Without another word, he walked back to his house, leaving the bikers standing uncomfortably in his yard. As he reached his front door, he heard one of them say quietly, "Man, that's messed up." That was his wife's. Inside his house, Harold placed the broken rose in a small vase on his kitchen table. His hands were steady now, and his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. It was time to show these young men what real strength looked like, and he knew exactly how to do it. Walking to his garage, he looked at the old tarp-covered shape in the corner and allowed himself a small smile. They had awakened something in him, something that had been dormant for decades. Tomorrow would be a very different day. That evening, after the bikers had left for the day, Harold sat in his study, surrounded by boxes he hadn't opened in years. Dust floated in the air, catching the light from his old desk lamp as he carefully lifted the lid off a worn military trunk. The familiar smell of aged leather and old paper brought a flood of memories. His hands, wrinkled but still strong, pulled out a leather-bound album. The first page held his military identification card from 1943. A young man with bright eyes and a determined expression stared back at him. Harold touched the photograph gently, remembering the day it was taken. He had been just 19 then, eager to serve his country. Turning the pages slowly, he came across photographs that told the story of his military service. There he was with his basic training unit, standing tall in pressed uniforms. Another showed him learning to ride his first military motorcycle. Harold smiled, remembering how nervous he had been during those first lessons. The instructors had been tough but fair, teaching him not just to ride but to understand every part of the machine. A larger photograph caught his attention. It showed Harold with his motorcycle scout unit in France, 1944. They were a specialized group, responsible for reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. Their motorcycles had been more than just vehicles. They were lifelines, carrying them through danger and back to safety. "We were quite a sight," Harold murmured to himself, studying the faces of his old comrades. Many of them were gone now, but he remembered each one. There was Jimmy from Tennessee, who could fix any engine with just a wrench and some wire, and Marcus from Chicago, whose riding skills had saved their unit more than once. As he continued through the album, he found what he had been looking for, a photograph of himself with his prized 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA. The military motorcycle had been his constant companion through the war. In the picture, he was leaning against it, halfway through a maintenance check. The same motorcycle now sat in his garage, covered but still perfectly maintained. Harold reached deeper into the trunk and pulled out a small box. Inside were his medals, a Bronze Star for bravery during a crucial reconnaissance mission, and various service medals that told the story of his journey through Europe. Each one brought back vivid memories of the brotherhood he had shared with his fellow riders. Among the papers in the trunk, he found his old service manual for the Harley-Davidson. Its pages were worn from constant use, with notes scribbled in the margins, tips and tricks he had learned during his service. He had memorized every word, every diagram. Even now, he could recall exactly how to adjust the timing, tune the carburetor, or repair the transmission. A newspaper clipping caught his eye. It was from 1945, showing his unit after the war ended. They were celebrating, their motorcycles lined up proudly behind them. The caption read, "Motorcycle Scouts Return Heroes." Harold remembered that day clearly, the joy of victory mixed with the solemn understanding of all they had witnessed. As the evening grew later, Harold found himself immersed in more recent photographs. There was one of him teaching his son to ride a bicycle, using the same patient instruction he had learned as a motorcycle scout. Another showed him and Martha at a veterans reunion in 1975, standing proudly next to his restored military Harley. The last photograph in the album was from just 10 years ago, Harold riding his motorcycle in the Veterans Day Parade. He had kept the bike in perfect condition all these years, though few knew about it. It wasn't just a machine to him. It was a connection to his past, to the man he had been and still was inside. Looking at these memories, Harold felt something stirring in his chest. The young man in these photographs hadn't backed down from challenges. He had faced danger with courage and skill. Age might have slowed his steps, but it hadn't changed who he was at heart. He closed the album carefully and stood up, his decision made. Walking to his garage, he flipped on the light and pulled the tarp off his motorcycle. The chrome still gleamed, the army green paint still looked fresh. Tomorrow, he would remind everyone, including himself, that some things never change, like courage, respect, and the bond between a rider and his machine. Harold patted the motorcycle's leather seat. "Time to ride again, old friend," he whispered. "We've got one more mission." The next morning broke clear and crisp, with the first rays of sunlight finding Harold already in his garage. He had slept little, his mind filled with memories and plans. Now, dressed in his old work clothes, he stood before his beloved 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA military motorcycle, tools spread out on a clean white cloth beside it. The bike gleamed under the garage lights, its army green paint still pristine after all these years. Harold had maintained it religiously, even when he stopped riding regularly. Every month, he would start it up, check the fluids, and clean it thoroughly. Now, his careful maintenance would finally pay off. With methodical precision, Harold began his work. His old hands moved with surprising steadiness as he checked every component. The spark plugs were first. He cleaned and regapped them carefully. Then came the carburetor, which he dismantled and inspected piece by piece. The air filter needed replacing, so he pulled a new one from his carefully organized spare parts shelf. As he worked, the sound of motorcycles began to fill the morning air. The bikers were arriving for their daily gathering, but today their noise didn't bother Harold. He smiled slightly as he adjusted the chain tension, remembering how he used to do this same maintenance under much more dangerous conditions during the war. The oil needed changing, so he drained it carefully and replaced it with fresh oil. He checked the transmission fluid, adjusted the clutch, and tested the brakes. Each task was performed with the precision that had been drilled into him during his military service. "A motorcycle is only as good as its maintenance," his old sergeant used to say. Around mid-morning, Mrs. Thompson from next door noticed his garage door open and brought him a cup of coffee. She stood in amazement, looking at the motorcycle. "Harold," she gasped, "I had no idea you had such a beautiful machine. How long have you had it?" "Since 1945, he replied, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "Bought it from the military after the war. Same one I rode in Europe." Mrs. Thompson looked from the motorcycle to the noisy group across the street and back to Harold. A knowing smile crossed her face. "Are you planning what I think you're planning?" Harold just winked and took a sip of coffee. "Every soldier knows the importance of proper timing, Martha." By early afternoon, the motorcycle was ready. Harold had cleaned every inch of chrome until it sparkled. The leather seat had been conditioned, the gauges wiped clean, and every bolt checked and tightened. The last task was to check his old military uniform, which he had pulled out the night before. To his satisfaction, the uniform still fit, though a bit more snugly than it had in 1945. He laid it out carefully on a clean workbench, the olive drab jacket with his sergeant's stripes and combat patches, the matching pants, his polished brown boots, and his old cavalry helmet. Harold took a short break, sitting on his workbench and looking at his handiwork. The motorcycle looked exactly as it had in the old photographs, perhaps even better. He started it up, and the engine roared to life immediately, settling into the distinctive Harley-Davidson idle that he knew so well. The sound attracted attention from across the street. Through his garage door, Harold could see several of the bikers looking his way curiously. One pointed at the distinctive sound, clearly recognizing it was different from their modern machines. Harold shut off the engine and closed his garage door. Everything was ready. Tomorrow was Saturday, the day when the largest number of bikers gathered in the parking lot. It would be the perfect time to make his statement. That evening, as he sat in his favorite chair, Harold felt a peace he hadn't experienced in weeks. He wasn't nervous about tomorrow. He had faced far worse situations in his life. Instead, he felt a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done and having the means to do it. Before going to bed, he took one last look in his garage. The motorcycle sat ready, his uniform hung pressed and perfect, and his old cavalry boots stood polished to a mirror shine. Tomorrow would be more than just a ride. It would be a lesson in respect, delivered in a language these young bikers would understand. Rest well, old friend. He patted the motorcycle's tank. Tomorrow, we ride again. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for riding, clear skies and calm winds. Harold was up before dawn, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He dressed slowly in his military uniform, each button and badge perfectly aligned, just as he had done thousands of times before. The uniform felt like greeting an old friend. By 9 o'clock, the parking lot across the street was filling up with motorcycles. More riders were arriving by the minute, their modern machines gleaming in the morning sun. The usual rowdy atmosphere was building, with loud music playing and engines revving competitively. In his garage, Harold sat astride his Harley-Davidson Doliole, taking a moment to feel the familiar leather seat beneath him. His cavalry helmet sat snugly on his head, and his boots rested naturally on the foot pegs. He took a deep breath, said a quiet prayer, and pressed the starter button. The vintage motorcycle roared to life with a sound that was distinctly different from the modern bikes across the street. It was deeper, more rhythmic, a sound that had once been heard on the battlefields of Europe. Harold let it idle for a few minutes, allowing the engine to warm up properly. Mrs. Thompson and several other neighbors had gathered quietly in their yards, watching and waiting. They had never seen Harold like this before. The transformation from quiet gardener to military veteran was striking. Even at 93, he sat straight and proud on his motorcycle. Harold clicked the bike into first gear and slowly rode down his driveway. The moment he turned onto the street, the atmosphere in the parking lot began to change. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned toward the unmistakable sound of the approaching vintage motorcycle. As he pulled into the parking lot, the modern bikes parted like water, their riders stepping back in surprise. Harold guided his motorcycle with the skill of someone who had spent countless hours in the saddle. He came to a stop in the center of the lot, his boot touching the ground with practiced ease. Spike, who had been in the middle of telling a loud story, fell silent. The whole group stared at the elderly man on the military motorcycle. Harold's uniform gleamed with medals and combat patches, each telling its own story of service and sacrifice. Without saying a word, Harold began to demonstrate the maneuvers he had performed countless times during the war. He executed perfect figure eights, the big military bike moving with surprising grace. He demonstrated the tight turns and controlled stops that had once helped him navigate through dangerous situations. The bikers watched in stunned silence as Harold then performed the complex motorcycle drill patterns that military scouts had used. His movements were precise, each maneuver flowing smoothly into the next. The vintage Harley responded to his every command as if bike and rider were one. One of the older bikers removed his bandana, revealing a Marine Corps tattoo. He stepped forward and snapped to attention, offering a crisp salute. Others with military backgrounds followed suit, recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing. After completing his demonstration, Harold brought his motorcycle to a perfect stop in the center of the lot. The engine's rumble echoed off the surrounding buildings as he surveyed the crowd. Dozens of faces stared back at him, expressions ranging from shock to admiration. Slowly, Harold removed his helmet. His white hair caught the morning sun, and his eyes were clear and steady. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the now silent parking lot. "This is a 1942 Harley-Davidson Dualier," he said, his voice strong and clear. "I rode one just like it through France and Germany, delivering messages that helped win the war. The men I served with understood something important. Respect isn't about how loud you can be or how much chaos you can cause. It's about how you conduct yourself and treat others." The silence that followed was profound. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Spike stood frozen, his usual smirk replaced by an expression of genuine respect. Several of his companions had removed their sunglasses, wanting to see clearly the man and machine before them. In that moment, Harold had done more than make a statement. He had bridged a gap between generations, between past and present, using the universal language of motorcycles to deliver a lesson in respect that no words alone could have conveyed. The silence in the parking lot was broken by the sound of heavy boots on pavement. Spike was walking toward Harold, his face showing the mix of emotions. The usual swagger in his step was gone, replaced by something more hesitant, almost respectful. As he got closer, everyone could see his eyes were fixed not on Harold, but on the military motorcycle. "Sir," Spike said, his voice unusually quiet, "would you mind if I take a closer look at your bike?" The word "sir" fell naturally from his lips, surprising even himself. Harold nodded, and Spike approached the motorcycle slowly. His hand reached out to touch the army green tank, then stopped, waiting for permission. Harold smiled and gestured for him to go ahead. The younger man's fingers traced the military markings with surprising gentleness. "My grandfather," Spike said, his voice thick with emotion. "He rode one of these in the war. He never talked much about it, but he had a photo of himself with his motorcycle on our living room wall." He paused, swallowing hard. "He passed away last year." Harold's expression softened. "What was his unit?" he asked. "8th Cavalry Regiment," Spike replied. "He was a motorcycle scout too." Harold's eyes widened. "I knew men in the 8th. What was your grandfather's name?" "James Connor," Spike said, but everyone called him Jimmy. Harold's hand gripped the handlebar tightly. "Jimmy Connor from Tennessee. The mechanic who could fix anything with just a wrench and some wire?" Spike's jaw dropped. "You knew my grandfather." "Knew him?" Harold chuckled. "He saved my life more than once. There was this time in France when my bike broke down behind enemy lines. Your grandfather rode out alone to find me, fixed my motorcycle under fire, and got us both back to safety." By now, other riders had gathered around, forming a respectful circle. The earlier tension had completely disappeared, replaced by a sense of shared history and understanding. Some of the older riders began sharing their own family stories of military service. "My father was in Vietnam," one said. "Rode motorcycles there too. My aunt was a military police officer in Iraq," another added. "She taught me how to ride." Spike looked at the damaged garden behind them, then back at Harold. Shame crossed his face. "Sir, about your garden and your wife's roses. We were wrong. I was wrong. Let us make it right." Harold studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Jimmy would have been the first to help replant those roses," he said quietly. "He always said that how you fix your mistakes shows more about your character than the mistakes themselves." Spike nodded, then turned to address his group. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to rebuild Mr. Peterson's garden. Anyone who wants to call themselves part of this club will be here at sunrise with tools and new plants." The response was immediate and unanimous. Riders began offering to bring soil, flowers, and gardening tools. One mentioned his sister owned a nursery and could provide new rose bushes. Another suggested building a small memorial bench near the roses in honor of Martha. As the plans took shape, Harold started his motorcycle again. The familiar rumble drew everyone's attention back to him. "You know," he said, looking at Spike, "your grandfather taught me something important about motorcycles. He said they're not just machines, they're bridges between people. Doesn't matter if it's a military bike from World War II or a modern cruiser. When you respect the machine and the people around you, you become part of something bigger than yourself. Spike nodded, understanding flowing between the veteran and the young rider. The connection that had been forged wasn't just about motorcycles or military service. It was about finding common ground between generations, about learning that respect goes both ways. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, plans were made, stories were shared, and bridges were built. The parking lot that had been a source of tension became a place of healing and understanding. Harold's statement hadn't just ended the bullying, it had created something new and unexpected. A true brotherhood of riders, spanning generations and experiences, united by respect for both the machines they rode and the stories they carried. 6 months had passed since Harold's memorable ride, and the corner of Maple and Oak Street had transformed completely. The garden that had once been trampled now bloomed more beautifully than ever, tended not just by Harold, but by a rotating group of bikers who stopped by regularly to help. On this particular Sunday afternoon, the parking lot was full, but not with the chaos that had once dominated the space. Instead, neat rows of motorcycles, both modern and vintage, lined the area. At the center stood a new addition, a handcrafted wooden sign reading Veterans Riders Memorial Garden. Harold sat on the memorial bench that the bikers had built near Martha's rose bush, which now flourished with more blooms than ever before. Beside him sat Spike, who had become a regular visitor. They were watching a group of young riders listening intently to another veteran sharing stories about his service in Vietnam. The motorcycle club had undergone its own transformation. Under Spike's leadership, they had established a mentorship program pairing veteran riders with younger ones. Every weekend, they organized rides that combined the thrill of motorcycling with lessons in history and respect. Harold's military Harley-Davidson had become the centerpiece of their monthly Veterans Appreciation events. "You know," Spike said, adjusting his now clean leather vest that displayed a new patch, "Veterans Legacy Riders. My grandfather would have loved this. He always wanted me to understand what riding was really about." Harold nodded, watching as a young girl carefully placed flowers at the base of a small monument they had erected listing the names of local veterans who had ridden motorcycles in service. Her father, one of the club members, explained to her the significance of each name. The parking lot had become more than just a meeting place. Local schools now brought students here for history lessons, where they could see Harold's military motorcycle and hear first-hand accounts from veterans of different eras. The grocery store owner had even designated the area as a permanent memorial space, installing proper lighting and benches. "Did you ever think," Harold asked, looking at Spike, "that one ride could change so much?" Spike shook his head, smiling. "Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected teachers." He paused, then added, "We're starting that scholarship program next month, helping veterans' kids learn motorcycle maintenance. Already have 10 signed up." Harold beamed with pride. The program had been Spike's idea, inspired by the stories of how military mechanics like his grandfather had kept their units running during the war. The local technical college had eagerly partnered with them, offering their facilities for classes. As the afternoon sun began to set, more people gathered in the garden. It was time for their weekly tradition, the sunset salute. Riders of all ages lined up beside their motorcycles, standing at attention. Harold, supported by Spike, walked to his restored WLA, which now had a special place of honor in the garden. At exactly sunset, Harold started his motorcycle. The deep, rhythmic rumble echoed across the lot. One by one, other bikes came to life, not in the chaotic roar of the past, but in a coordinated, respectful tribute. The sound rolled across the neighborhood like a gentle thunder, a reminder of the power of respect and understanding. Mrs. Thompson, watching from her porch, wiped a tear from her eye. The neighborhood hadn't just become peaceful again, it had become a community bound together by an unexpected brotherhood of riders and veterans. As the engines quieted, Harold looked around at the transformed space. Martha's roses bloomed bright and strong, surrounded by new gardens planted by caring hands. The once rowdy parking lot had become a place of honor, learning, and connection. Young riders learned from old veterans, and old veterans found new purpose in sharing their stories. "You know what the best part is?" Harold said to Spike as they watched the crowd disperse for the evening. "Every person who stops here, every story shared, every lesson learned, it becomes part of something bigger. It becomes legacy." Spike nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. What had started as a conflict between an old veteran and a group of bikers had grown into something that would outlast them all, a living memorial to respect, service, and the enduring bond between riders of all generations. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Harold's military motorcycle stood proudly in its place of honor, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not through confrontation, but through connection.